Hey everyone, so I'm going to try actually recording a tutorial on how to start building these immersive 3D worlds. Maybe about just to summarize real quickly, about 5 years I published the first video for this project, and I basically showed how in a web browser we could make a world that was basically cube based or voxel based, I guess it's called, where we basically put these various cubes of different colors in this 3D world, and we walked around and rotated around the world. It was pretty cool. I also demonstrated how you could sort of stack cubes and build a castle, and eventually you could also delete cubes and things like that. And then kind of I got more colorful with it, so started adding some designs. And rather than just controlling a cube in this 3D space, here in this video, I'm actually controlling a very simple character who's made up of a cube, and also I forgot what this 3D shape is called, but basically it's not a cube, but it's still a six-sided figure with all 90-degree angles. Anyway, so by far the most common comment I got was whether I could make a tutorial or not. That was probably the #1 request. There were a lot of other developer questions, so I would definitely want to get around to answering those at some point too. But basically, I thought I would make at least one tutorial video, see how it goes, see if it's actually helpful to people, and then from there I could expound in any direction that the viewers wanted, in terms of maybe we could go into making cubes, we could go more into the JavaScript, we could even go more into the physics or the HTML, the CSS, whatever, or we could maybe even go in all directions. So yeah, for this first tutorial, I'm basically just calling it from the ground up because, as you notice, all of these worlds kind of have a ground. So this is actually a ground made of cubes. This is a whole bunch of cubes with a green top on them. Same thing here. And then here, finally, I just used a div well, actually, this is a few large divs sort of laying flat to constitute the ground. So basically in this first tutorial, I just wanted to show very basically how to make the ground. It's actually not too difficult. And once you make the ground, from there, you can start to stack cubes on top of the ground. You can start to rotate the ground. You can control a character on the ground and so on. So that's pretty much going to be this first tutorial. If you'd like to see more tutorials, if I could just super kindly just ask for a quick like and a quick subscribe, because those numbers, I'll admit, seeing that sort of makes me want to, it is a motivator. It tells me that this information is helpful to you guys, and it sort of motivates me to also continue on the project. So that would be awesome. But anyway, yeah, here's a tutorial about how to make basically the ground with this sort of background. So I'm not sure, it's this being the first tutorial, I'm not sure where the best place is to start, because as web developers know, there's so many different perspectives through which you can look at a web page. Obviously, the end result is looking at the web page through the web browser, just like the general public would look at it. But as you also know, there's the page source. Very simple. This being the first tutorial, this is extremely simple. So I can go through and explain it this way. As many of you know, there's also the inspect elements window, or the developer window, whatever it's called. And we can look at the elements sort of this way, in a more objective way, I would say. With all the HTML tags and the CSS that's attached to each of those tags and so on. So I think, and then of course, and then there's the source code window in which I'm actually typing and editing the source code. So if I just quickly go in here and pull up the actual view, here it is. So here's the source code, but this is actually in a text editor. So I'm not sure what the best approach is, so I'll just dive into it, and hopefully this sort of gets into the flow of how we can sort of build this extremely simple world. So I'll actually start here where we're in the browser. I think this is a great explanation of what we're looking at. Let me sort of adjust the screen size a little bit here. And my favorite part, what is this view actually called? I think it's called the developer view or something like that. What is it actually? Okay, view developer tools. Okay, so it's called the developer tools window. And my favorite part about this view is, you can just see what HTML elements are all here. You can do this on any web page on the internet, and you can just click on any one, and you can see what the CSS is. And by the way, in this tutorial, this is all HTML and CSS. There's no JavaScript here. This is just HTML and CSS. So let me expand all of the HTML tags so we can see exactly what's going on. So basically, all we have is an HTML tag. Most of you probably already know that every HTML document starts with an and ends with an HTML tag. No surprise there. This first line, by the way, just tells us we're using HTML5. In the head, this is basically going to contain our title. So I'm calling this world from the ground up. And then here's the CSS. I'm putting it within the style tags, and so I'll get more into that a little bit later. And then in the body area here, we have the meat of our world, I would say. So we have an HTML4D world tag and an HTML4D ground tag. These all need to be closed. So where we have the HTML4D world start tag, we also have an end tag. Same thing for the ground. Okay, and by the way, these are custom tags, so these tags don't actually exist out in the wild, but in HTML5 you can create your own tags. As long as the tag has a hyphen, the browser should recognize it as your own custom tag, and then once you have your own custom tag, you can apply CSS towards it just like it was a regular div or something like that. So what I kind of like about this hierarchy is what's in a world while inside a world is the ground. And I like how HTML accurately represents that ground is inside the world. Since HTML is a hierarchical language, or since elements contain other elements, it kind of almost semantically makes sense that the ground is contained within the world. It's not adjacent to the world. It's not at the same level as the world. It's actually a sub-object of the world itself. So I think that's a gorgeous sub-fact, if you will, about this setup. So really, so the only custom tags we're using here are HTML4D world and HTML4D ground. This attribute's actually not being used, so we can just sort of ignore that. That's kind of, we'll maybe be able to apply that much later in a future tutorial. But as of this tutorial, you can ignore the type graphs. In fact, that doesn't even have to be there. If you're typing this HTML at home, you can even just omit that tag. It doesn't matter. Okay, so let's go through each of the HTML tags and figure out what's important so that when you start to build worlds on your own, you'll also be able to apply the same CSS. So what's important for the HTML? Well, we want the HTML to have a height of 100. And then we also want our body to have a height of 100. And the reason is because in HTML, if you don't have a height of 100, then the height of the web page by default is only the height of the objects in it. So if you just have a little bit of text that comes down maybe a third of the way down the page, the HTML tag technically, and the body tag as well, technically only comes down to a third of the page. But we want the HTML and the body to encompass the entire browser window here. So therefore, we have to make it height 100. Let me see if there's any other important stuff. It doesn't look like it. There's not really any other important stuff for the HTML tag specifically. I did specify that the language is English, but that's more of an SEO thing than anything else. Okay, so in the head tag, again, this is just where we're going to put some sort of metadata about our web page. So I'm calling the web page title from the ground up. That's obviously going to be our web page title, and then the CSS is going to go within the style tags, and I'll get into that in just a second. Okay, so in the body tag, We have a height of 100. We also want to make sure we turn off padding. I don't think we have to turn off margin by oh, we do have to. Okay, so margin we have to set to 0. Otherwise, Chrome will set it to, I believe it's 10 pixels by default. So we don't want this little white margin in all 4 sides here. Get rid of that. Padding, I don't think we need that, but I'm just going to leave that there just so it's explicitly set rather than relying on defaults. Okay, so with HTML4D, with this HTML4D world tag, let's see, what are we going to do? So the HTML4D world tag is, it's not, basically it's going to contain our background. So here's why it was important for the body and the HTML to be set to 100% height, because we want the width and height of HTML4D world to be the entire width and height of the browser as well. So therefore, we set the world to be width 100%, height 100%. We want to set it to display block. It's not really going, I mean, by default, it should be block anyway, but this obviously is not an inline graphic or an inline anything at all. It's definitely going to be its standalone div. And then everything that goes into the world will go between the HTML world open tag and the HTML4D world close tag. Okay, and then as you can see, I put some cool little graphic as the background. So I put this stars.jpg. This is a free clip art I grabbed online. And I just said background position center, background repeat, no repeat. So this just, background position center just centers it. So if you don't center it, actually it looks kind of cool when it's not centered, so maybe I'll leave it like that for a little bit. And then background repeat. The graphic's large enough where I don't need it to repeat, so I just set it to no repeat. Overflow hidden. I don't want the page to be scrollable, so what ends up happening with this large ground div is once you rotate it, the browser thinks it wants to start scrolling to the left and right, and things get a little ugly when you can scroll this world, and I don't want it to be scrollable. So anything that's outside of the world is hidden, and this will be extremely useful later. So we want to just hide everything that's outside the world, basically. As this again, this is why this is why physics comes into play a lot here, because basically what we're stating with code is that nothing exists outside of the world. It's kind of an interesting sorry, we're not stating nothing exists outside of the world. We're stating that nothing is visible outside of the world. Nothing is detectable, observable outside of the world. And that's kind of an interesting concept. But that's basically what this checkbox means for us. Okay, so that's what all of these attributes do. Now within the world, we have the ground. So this is probably going to be the most fun part. Let me turn off. Well, actually, before I turn it off, let me explain what all of these do. Okay, so here we have another. Basically, we want it to display like a div, so we're saying display block. Our ground is going to be 200 pixels by 200 pixels width and height, and it's a flat. All divs are always flat, so there's not like a third dimension of depth or anything like that. It's just width and height. Transform, that's probably the most fun one, so let me just come back to that in just a second. Background image, again, pretty self-explanatory. I put an image of a desert background here, and then for the background position, I centered the background. You don't necessarily have to. I just centered it just because here in this case, this ground is larger than the background image, so you'll notice it repeats. If you look carefully here, the background actually repeats itself. So you can center it. You can find a different image if you want. You can find a larger image so that it doesn't have to repeat. But anyway, coming back to the transform, this is the most fun attribute here. So let me just turn off the transform for a second, because we're all familiar with 2D web pages where you can only scroll up, down, left, and right. So without the transform attribute, this is just a div that's 2000 by 2000, and just renders on a web page with this desert background, and it renders just like you would expect it would. But the reality is this ground actually has a rotation to it. It has a rotation of 0, 0, 0. And what I mean by that is it's rotated around the x-axis by 0, around the y-axis by 0, and around the z-axis by 0. And when I say 0, 0, 0, I mean 0 degrees. The units is degrees. So once I turn on this transform attribute, we get a world with rotation. So let me actually, so notice we've got 76, 0, and 47. The default's actually 0, 0, 0. So actually, let me set this back to 0, 0, 0. Okay. And so let me just remember what the original values were if I look at the source code. So the original values were 76, 0, and 47. Okay, so here we have a div that's 2000 by 2000 pixels in dimension with a rotation of 0, 0, 0. So notice how if I start to rotate it over the x-axis, and by the way, the x-axis is the axis that runs left to right on the screen here. So if I start to rotate it around the x-axis, so I start incrementing this value, what ends up happening is we start to see this image get skewed. And as you can imagine, we're rotating it around. You can almost imagine, you can almost see this x-axis here in the middle that I'm sort of rotating this image around. And I can rotate it as, you can pretty much set this to any number. So I'm rotating it. Once I get to 90 degrees, it should be just an infinitesimally small, the height, the observable height of this should be infinitesimally small. And then as I exceed 90 degrees, it'll start to rotate the other way. And I can even, by the way, I'm pressing the up arrow on my keyboard. So now this whole thing is upside down as we get to 180 degrees and so on. So you get the idea. You can play around with this. I think I set this to 76 degrees at this point because I want to just rotate. I just want, I want the world to look like it's 3D. So rather than what I'll do is, you can set this to whatever value you want. I thought that maybe a value of about here was pretty good, and I finally settled on 76. But whatever. At this point, I'll just set it to I'll just set it to 67 degrees. Okay, that's perfect. If I start to rotate it around the y-axis, so the y-axis is this axis. And I don't really want to rotate it around this axis because look what will happen is I'll start to go that way, I'll start to go the opposite direction. And I mean, it looks okay if you want to give your users the impression like they're on a wobbly surface, which again, that may come in the future for sure, then I guess you could just sort of make it wobbly, but I kind of want the ground, especially for the purposes of this tutorial, I just want the ground to look like it's stable, like we can put some characters on there and like they're not going to fall off. Actually, just watching this kind of gives me vertigo a little bit. So I'm just going to keep this at 0 degrees and not change that. And then finally, we have the Z rotation. So the Z rotation is rotation around the Z axis. So remember, this is the X axis, this is the Y axis, and so the Z axis, I can't really draw it on the screen for you, but basically it's the axis that comes out at you from the screen. So if you're looking at your screen, the X axis goes left and right, the Y axis goes top to bottom. The Z-axis comes out to you from the screen out to you in that third dimension, the Z dimension, if you will. Okay, so now we can sort of imagine this axis coming out at you. Imagine there's an axis coming right out at you, and we're going to rotate this div around that axis. So as I start to increase, or you can decrease this too. Negative values are completely allowed here, but I'm going to keep all the values positive for this tutorial just to keep things simple. You'll notice as I increase the Z rotation, you can sort of imagine this thing rotating around the z-axis. You can imagine it rotating around an imaginary axis that's at the screen, maybe around here at the center of this div, coming right out at you. And as I increase this rotate z value, it comes right out at you. So that is pretty much the tutorial. Let me just show the source real quick. This being an extremely, this being the very first tutorial, I didn't do a whole bunch of things like minifying the CSS, or I think there's a type attribute that I'm supposed to put here, style type, CSS, or, for SEO purposes, really the CSS should be in a separate style sheet, a separate CSS file, perhaps a minified CSS file. That will all come later. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I just wanted to keep it extremely simple, keep it on one document here, basically showing that our CSS is really simple. Just want to keep the HTML and height to be 100%. I sort of went through all the HTML 4D world attributes, and I just finished going through all the HTML 4D ground attributes, the most interesting one, of course, being the rotations. And then once you get into the actual the body itself, again, super simple stuff. We just have the ground that's within the world. You can disregard this grass attribute. Eventually, I'd like to be able to choose whether I want it to be grass or dirt or, I don't know, metal, brick, different sorts of materials maybe for the ground. But this is just maybe a preview of what's to come in the future, where you can specify things just based on this attribute. But anyway, until then, yeah, this source code is extremely simple. And what I'll do also, I renamed the project HTML4D just because we're going to be rendering objects across 4 dimensions using HTML. And so this URL here, as of now, is live. I plan on continuing this project. The project has gone through a few names and domain names. Sorry about that, but I'll link to this. So this way you can go directly to this world number 1 from the ground up. You'll be able to right-click, view source, see the source code for yourself. Feel free to copy and paste it. You'll be able to copy and paste it. What you'll need to do, you'll need to find your own images of stars in the desert, or I'm sure you'll want to play around with your own images of putting like a bright blue sky back here, or some clouds, and then maybe using a grass ground, or whatever type of ground you want, right? It's the possibilities are endless. What's the one error we're getting here? I don't know. Oh, okay, we're just not getting a fave icon. That's not part of this tutorial. Anyway, yeah, so that's pretty much the tutorial. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll try to be a little more proactive about responding to questions and maybe even addressing them in the tutorial as well. If you can, like I mentioned before, just give a like and a subscribe, just because that'll help keep the project going. Every little number helps for something, for a project that is this nascent. So I hope this helps, and I look forward to making tutorials, more tutorials to explain how we finally got to the point of these more immersive 3D worlds where we're controlling characters and there's collision detection and things like that. So thank you so much.